Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Jay Dyer back on the show. Jay, of course, is the proprietor of Jay's Analysis, jaysanalysis.com. He's the author of Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. You can purchase that book from his website, and he'll send you a signed copy. You're still doing that, Jay?
Absolutely.
Part 2 of an interview with Jay Dyer on the Globalist books by H.G. Wells, author Koestler, and Jonas Salk.
What's becoming noticeable in post-1950s writers who promote globalism, important globalist writers post-1950, is that they're much more amenable to the ideas of, quote, spirit. It seems that they had all kind of at some point agreed upon the difficulty of selling everyone on rank materialism and Darwinism, and so rather Darwinism can fit much more easily into something pseudo-spiritual, where man is evolving into godhood, and thus the promotion post-50s and 60s of the New Age. This fits very well with what Koestler talks about. So we could see Koestler maybe as a kind of a predecessor to Esalen Institute or New Age movement. And what he proposes is that, look, Darwinism is true because of mutations, right? There's all these mutations. Cells mutate. We have aberrations in nature. And therefore, since man himself is an aberration in nature, because the arising of man, I couldn't believe he said this, but he says the rise of man from Neolithic man is out of cannibalism. And he says pecking man is a cannibal. And so, because Peking Man was a cannibal, we can surmise that there's nothing inherently wrong about being parasitic on your own species. And he says, look, we observe this in nature. We all believe in nature in some sense. So therefore, anything that happens in nature is normal and, quote, natural. And since cannibalism happens in nature, since Peking Man is the beginning of conscious man out of caveman state, there's nothing wrong with being parasitic. And then he goes on to actually cite the examples of Aztecs and human sacrifice, cannibalism. I'm not joking. That's what he talks about. He doesn't speak of it in a negative light. He says, look, this has gone on. And he says, basically, is this not nature at work? Is a black plague not nature at work? And if the Black Plague and if cannibalism are just merely manifestations of nature, there's absolutely nothing wrong with creating bioweapons to mutate man. There's nothing wrong with flipping the gender of people through chemicals in the food, water, and atmosphere. This is what he says, by the way. So that's what we get with this character, who I definitely think I think you could definitely say he's an illuminist. He speaks of Thanatos, Greek for death, as the operant principle in nature that is just as powerful and important as life. So I think Zoe is the Greek word for life. So Zoe and Thanatos are equal principles in nature. And so here we get this Masonic sort of dualism where good is evil and evil is good. Why? Because good and evil are just based on principles of nature, and nature is both death and life.
Yeah, it's almost
so since everything is natural, and since the elite are basically the highest, and he shares this with Salk and Russell, by the way, since they are the highest forms of evolution, there is nothing wrong with them as the minstrels of evolution enacting basically a kind of mass kill-off, depopulation. He says because the elite function as the immune system of the planet. This is what Salk says too.
Yes. So, yeah, it's almost so they've ordained themselves.
Yes. And Salk, by the way, this is funny because Salk actually tries to explain this, and he says, look, if you were the true priests of nature, you would understand what I'm talking about. And since you don't believe in it or understand it, you're not the incarnation of Mother Nature.
Yeah, and of course, nature's nothing sacred or special about nature. It's just they're mutating all the time, and
it's just mutating process of life and death, right?
So you can't base anything on nature as a foundation for behavior or what's normal or what's proper, and it's there to be experimented upon. He cites Peking Man, but of course, wasn't Peking Man discovered to be a fraud?
Yep.
Oh well.
Right. Ghost in the Machine is, of course, 1967, I think. So this is prior to the outing of Nebraska Man, Peking Man, and Piltdown Man as frauds.
Thus, again, showing the function of Darwinism in creating this worldview that justifies genocide, more or less.
Correct. It is the epitome of the Victorian ethos, Anglo-Saxon preeminence. But that's not really Anglo-Saxon preeminence. It's more of a kind of degenerate elite intermarried into various groups, including it does. People always say, "Well, what does this have to do with the Talmud?" Well, the Talmud speaks of most humans as beasts. Mm-hmm. So you could see that this elite Darwinian ancient Hindu philosophy. And, by the way, the British, of course, had that same penchant for the Hindu caste system, right? That can easily blend with the Talmudic idea of most so-called humans not having a nefesh or a soul.
Yeah, and this, of course, you've pointed out that, with back to H.G. Wells, he's writing The Open Conspiracy roughly the same time that Aldous Huxley is penning Brave New World, and it's a very similar view. And it is funny.
I forgot to mention Brave New World should also be included in the Globalist book series, right?
Mm-hmm. But of course, Jonas Salk in his book, The Survival of the Wisest, of course, he's I think he's telegraphing or referring to survival of the fittest and Darwin, that idea. Why Jonas Salk, however disturbing his views are, of course, most people know Jonas Salk as the heroic figure who produced the first polio. Okay, we're back. Jonas Salk, who the father of the polio vaccine. Here's this person who's pioneering vaccinations. Of course, he's an advocate of depopulation, right?
Yes. One more thing I did want to mention on Koestler that's fascinating was just that he does have that towards the end of the book, those last few chapters that deal with mutating man.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And the mutating man chapter is a section that I included in my book, Esoteric Hollywood, where you do have a discussion of a 1966 or 7 CIA conference in San Francisco called the Control of the Mind Conference, and this was part of MK Ultra. Mm-hmm. You also have Koestler in a pretty significant section discussing MK Ultra, and he's talking about the possibilities of implantable electrodes in the mind and what they could do with shocking different hemispheres of the brain. And what I'm getting at is that Koestler was privy to this back in the 60s, whereas most people weren't, precisely because he either attended or knew about this mind control conference in San Francisco that was funded by Radio Liberty, the CIA. Excuse me. And at this conference, they literally do discuss altering the RNA, DNA to cause various types of not just experiments, but also mutations, sterility, cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So you have explicit statements from these guys about what their plans are.
And of course,
I just want to make that clear.
Yeah. And it's also important these books and what's in them, with the ideas that are contained in these books. These aren't the musings of some crackpots. These are people who are well connected. They're high up. And
this is an Order of the British Empire, honored man, great writer of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. And if you study the past 50, 60, maybe 75 years, you'll see elements of this program being implemented in various policies. They had
right.
The World Health Organization,
great example.
Sterilized women with HGC hormone in the tetanus shots. to sterilize them. I think a third of the Rockefeller Foundation sterilized a third of childbearing women in Puerto Rico in the 1940s and 50s.
Oh wow! Okay, yeah.
There's talk of contraceptive corn, which William Engdahl writes about in his book Seeds of Destruction. Of course, the big issue of GMOs and seeds and these things. GMO food being robbed of nutrients.
Oh, absolutely.
These things makes everyone sick and weaker, right? The reversal of the food pyramid back in the 70s.
Yes, under Carter, right?
Yeah.
Ford and Carter, right?
Yeah, so this is all part of that. Bertrand Russell talked about through diet and injections. Injunctions, right? Yeah. So these people, this program has been implemented from at varying time or varying degrees over the years that you can point to, and it's just a question of connecting the dots and stop seeing these things as episodes or separate events. There's a continuum here. There's a connection.
Yeah, they're not discontiguous.
Yeah.
Oops. Sorry, we
did it again.
We accidentally sprayed a city in St. Louis with bioweapon. Oops, sorry.
And of course, with Jonas Salk, the whole narrative of the poliomyelitis being virus-based and these things is somewhat dubious. If you look at it, it was probably, at least it appears to be, the paralysis that people suffered, perhaps was something else. Multi-factor poisons in the environment. There was the DDT spraying that was going on. There was a wide use of arsenic by dentists at that time. There's all types of things that might have caused paralysis, but they blamed this poliomyelitis, this virus, and they developed this vaccine, which actually crippled people. Which why they originally Salk vaccine was pulled off the market, and the Sabin vaccine was put on the market. And what they did during that period in the 50s when they introduced the Salk virus, I think it was 1954, if I have that right. At the very time they were introducing the vaccination, they're narrowing the diagnostic parameters of poliomyelitis. So what they're saying was they didn't get rid of polio, they just redefined it. There are still kids suffering from paralysis. No.
Oh wow, interesting. If I recall, there's a lot of similar material that's mentioned in Haslam's Dr. Mary's Monkey book, which is pretty good.
Yeah, that's the SV40 controversy.
That's the SV40 simian virus, which that famous CBC clip with Dr. Maurice Hilleman, where he's saying, "Oh yeah, they're laughing about it. Oh yeah, we put this in the vaccine, and it gave a bunch of people cancer, but it's a funny thing."
Which made a lot of people money 20 years later. And it's hard to believe. A lot of people don't understand or don't appreciate. Or don't understand how something as sinister could be thought of and implemented.
Remember Bill Gates in his COP2 lecture at TED Talk where he says, "If we get the right vaccines, we can get this population number down over the next couple decades."
Yeah, he calls it reproductive health. That you were talking about that thanatosis, this obsession with death. You see that. Obviously, in what we call reproductive medicine, because reproductive medicine today has very little to do with actually fertility. In fact, it's quashing fertility and controlling fertility.
This is actually discussed by Salk, so you're absolutely right. Salk, in his Survival of the Wisest, rephrases Darwin from the fittest to the wisest, and of course he means the scientific priest class, the Darwinian priest class. The servants, of the Rockefellers who were funding all the vaccine mass inoculation stuff. So what Salk proposes in this book is that there was Epoch A, which was mankind all the way up until the time of Jonas Salk.
Oh, okay.
And Epoch A was the time of population explosion. And he says, oh, look, we had these fruit fly tests where we put a bunch of fruit flies in a bubble, and they reproduced to such an extent that they all died. And look at the graphs here and the charts that I have of the population explosion of humans, and can't you see the parallel? It's very scientific. It's all these graphs and charts. Look how we're going to be like the fruit flies, right? So you have, again, the repetition of this old
He's just Thomas Malthus, yeah.
It's another Malthusian scare tactic, crisis, catastrophism. And who does he cite for all this? Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich, the co-author of Ecoscience, I believe, and the father of the Ice Age. We're all going to die in the coming Ice Age of the 70s and 80s.
The population bomb. Yeah, that book.
Right.
And this of course informs the Club of Rome and Maurice Strong eventually, and implements Agenda 21. So it's interesting because I think Paul Ehrlich is an entomologist.
Mm-hmm.
He knows
bugs.
He knows bugs, and I think
humans are viewed as bugs.
Yeah, and it's the same way that Alfred Kinsey was a zoologist.
All right.
Act like an animal. Everyone's an animal.
Yeah.
If you look at, of course, if you just look at the whole history of vaccinations and public health and these things, of course, the health revolution occurred before any mass vaccination program. Actually, it can be attributed to just better hygiene, public sanitation, and better diet. Nothing to do with medical intervention. And the problems of health, of course, we've had this tightening or increase of the scheduling for vaccinations, and increase, and with that, of course, a increase in chronic health problems, allergies, explosion of allergies, and of course, not to mention autism, which you and Chris have speculated could be a plan. And when you listen to the videotape of Maurice Hillman laughing, knowingly tainting these things with SV40 virus, I think that would cause cancer. It's a polyoma would cause soft tissue cancer. You have the now we're in the middle of a soft tissue cancer epidemic with young people, which will also increase. That will have an effect on fertility and life and these things. And strangely enough, it also some of these cancers attack parts of the body that had to do with fertility and nurturing, whether breast cancer, ovarian cancer.
No, this is exactly what Salk says. He says that we, as the priestly class, must take on the difficult responsibility of weaponizing and engineering not just the principles of life in nature, but also death. And he says that this can be done in various ways. He says that we can cause disadvantageous or advantageous effects through manipulating the eggs, the reproductive system of the woman, or in other ways, the males as well. The notion that the local schools and local hospitals are following a big pharma mandate that says that you have to get 60 vaccines by the time you're however many, 36 months old or whatever.
Yeah.
That is insane. Mm-hmm. And that is obviously something to do, because all those same big pharma companies are the ones mentioned by Maurice Hillman, and that he in that case they were working with Merck. And if you look at Salk and Salk Institute, this is all connected to Merck as well. Hillerman mentioned Salk. So Salk is basically an agent of the corporate Rockefeller apparatus. Mm-hmm. He's like one of the front men. He's a kind of Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson of Big Pharma is all he is. And that's why he's propped up as a hero on the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah, he's Time magazine, of course, Henry Luce.
Yep.
They also promoted Kinsey, and they're
yes, good point.
Yeah. And you put him in a white coat. This is the age of science, and
he holds up some tubes with some liquids of color in it.
Look, a beaker and a lot of numbers. Look at all those numbers. I'm intimidated. I can't question that. There are numbers on the board. I can't question that. So it's okay to give my infant newborn son a shot for hepatitis B vaccine. Mm-hmm. These things with full of mercury or whatever happens to fall in there when it's being developed in China or something, some factory in China.
Oh, right.
And that's So that's and again, the idea that someone would write a book like this with these manipulating or the pirating or manipulating of the reproductive process, the intentional poisoning of the population with the purpose of curbing population growth, changing humanity, and this guy's a hero, and you're going to trust him to put a needle in your arm?
Yeah, there's so many different ways we could critique this guy. And, for example, most of the modern Darwinians, the deGrasse Tyson, Dawkins types, would affirm that they are scientists and not into metaphysics. However, when I read Jonas Salk's book, he's very comfortable consistently talking about metaphysics and his speculations about metabiology and the ego being of man, none of which is observed in a microscope, by the way. Yeah. None of which is empirical, all of which is a metaphysical speculation connected to his religion. And he does actually describe it in many religious glowing terms. So I'm having a hard time figuring out how exactly his use of metaphysics, quote unquote, is allowable, but anyone else discussing metaphysics would be called a kook, a medieval superstition, retard, retrograde, regressive. Next, we could consider the fact that he calls any position that claims to be dogmatic and certain egomaniacal and characteristic of epoch A of man, which is where man could be self-willed in order to propel the species towards greater population. He says, but now we've entered epoch B, and in order to avoid the annihilation of the species, we must kill off most of the species. So in other words, he says that if you are objective in your morals and your beliefs and your views, and if you're dogmatic, he says you are regressive and part of epoch A of mankind, which is done with. You are part of devolution. He says that we, the scientific priest class, are part of epoch B, which is where the scientists step forward to engineer evolution to control population on a mass level. And thus, the survival of the wisest is the only way for the species to go into the future. So in other words, by his own qualifications, being the most dogmatic imaginable, he himself has refuted himself. Because he says that if you're dogmatic, you're part of the old age. But he has the most dogmatic view imaginable because he actually says that there need to be structures in place to get rid of people that believe in absolutist morals or God or any of that stuff. Basically, Christians or conservatives need to be killed, is what he's saying.
Yeah, which is why this group has always promoted sort of this ecumenical mysticism, which has spirituality, but no real doctrine or faith or morality to it. Yeah.
But wait a minute, though. Now, on one level, that's right. But what I'm saying is that this is actually a trick. And behind those idiots who believe that nonsense, you actually have the most fanatical zealot religion ever that is intent on being way more extreme than the Inquisition. Mm-hmm. In other words, the Inquisition didn't say that everybody had to die. And here you have these religious zealots saying, in order for the species to survive, we must enact genocide.
Yeah. And I think you made the point how under traditional society or religions, there are certain strictures or rules about how you conduct yourself, how you live, and these things, how you behave. But they don't have speech codes or thought codes. There's no thought crimes. But under these people, there's speech codes, there's thought crime, all these things. So they're far more restrictive than any traditional religion in the final analysis. Yeah,
that's a great point. Yeah. And I remember years ago, Alex Jones would talk about how the Agenda 21 people cite the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayas as potential kinds of religions to emulate in the future, that the green movement could learn from those kinds of cannibalistic cults. And I thought that sounded a bit extreme. I was like, where's he getting that? And he would always mention some UN document, and I never could find it. And now that I've actually read some of these guys, that's actually not far-fetched. I mean, Koestler says that he's a fan of the Aztecs and the Mayans, and Salk could easily fit into that, because Salk says, like Koestler, that death is natural, and if death is natural, then there's not really any metaphysical distinction between birthing and killing. They're just actions. There's not one better or less than the other. Ultimately speaking, you might not like it, but there's not one better or less than the other.
Yeah.
It's just a vast cosmic, process. That's all there is to it. So what I'm getting at is that I didn't really go into this in depth, but I'm sure some people will take issue with this, but this is a very strong argument against theistic evolution, by the way. because anyone who espouses theistic evolution essentially has to believe that death is in some sense natural, and that death occurred for millions of aeons, prior to the rise of Adam and Eve, or caveman, or whatever you believe in. And if death is natural, I would challenge anyone to explain how Koestler and Salk are wrong. How is death not just as good or necessary as life? And I think I don't want to necessarily try to get into an argument or go too far afield, but this is one of the strongest points, I think, for traditional Orthodox Christianity, is that we believe Christ is the antidote to death, and so he destroys all of death. Paul says this in Romans 8, that the entire creation groans to be delivered from the bondage of the corruption that Adam brought.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the whole point, really, of the resurrection. Yeah,
there's a profound philosophical, I guess you could say, concession being made there.
Well, we believe that the resurrection is cosmic in scope. In other words, that it will essentially remedy, and not just the death of man's soul, but of course the resurrection of man and the renovation of the cosmos. And that's relevant because it actually counteracts the full extent of what Adam brought in the fall. And if you don't believe in Adam and Eve in the fall, you really can't explain death. And so, in other words, this is this is why, for example, Genesis we believe is part of Revelation. In other words, the doctrine of creation is not natural. If you were like a Thomist or something, but creation is actually a revealed doctrine. That's why none of these people come up with it. You don't ever see a natural philosopher come to believe in ex nihilo creation, ever. Yeah. They never do. They always propose some process philosophy or some sort of pantheism or paganism. Anyway, I'm just making a point that what you do see in Koestler and Salk is them, in a way, trying to be consistent in a very dark way with the idea of the presence of death in nature. And we see the present world as very unnatural, right? Death is unnatural for us. It is not at all natural.
I always thought the attempt to rationalize theistic view with Darwinism, Darwinism, was an attempt made by Christians, particularly the Catholic Church, when the Pope wrote that there wasn't necessarily a contradiction there. Was a belief that somehow the evidence for Darwinism was so overwhelming, right, that they had to make some sort of concession, which I've never found the evidence for Darwinism to be that compelling to begin with. So why even make that concession? It's like,
yeah, and it's very curious too that it's a lot of the these Jesuits that pioneer it, and I think that they were already kind of corrupt by the time they're pioneering and really promoting this stuff. And by the time you get Teilhard de Chardin, who, by the way, I should include in my Globalist book series because he is an important illuminist, Teilhard de Chardin basically sees Darwinism as Christianity. I mean, he reinterprets the entirety of Christianity into a process philosophy of Darwinism where everything is evolving to a kind of omega point, which is basically just kind of Hegelianism in some way. It's a version of Hegelianism, process philosophy, and Darwinism under the guise of paleontology. And by the way, isn't it interesting that he pops up at several of these frauds? I don't remember the exact ones, but I think he's at Piltdown. And he pops up in one of the other ones, like Nebraska Man, I think. Why is he there?
Yeah.
And by the way, he was so bad, he was actually excommunicated by either Pius XII or even John the 23rd. I mean, he was like really out there. I mean, I think he was rehabilitated by John the 23rd, if I recall, or something to that degree, but to that effect. But anyway, I think that these, when you really look at the guys who are the exemplars of that worldview, the Koestlers and the Salks and the Russells, there's just absolutely no way you could meld those with Christianity. And another argument I'll make too that you don't really hear people make much is, it's not just a question of the difficulties of interpreting the text of Genesis 1 and 2. There's another problem, and that's the problem of the way that Jesus speaks of Adam, Eve, in Genesis 1 and 2, which you have to soon say, I guess those gospel texts were Christ just talking about Adam and Eve as actual people, and where he talks about the creation of Adam and Eve, well, I guess those are wrong too. And then what you've done is basically open the door to higher criticism, because now, in order to save your presuppositions about what you're saying in theistic evolution about Genesis 1 and 2, you've got to now reinterpret or revise or redact the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait a minute. I guess we also have to look at Paul's epistles, because Paul talks about creation and he talks about Adam and Eve, right? Oh, we got to redact those too.
And that's the ball rolling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't understand that you have to follow through there to be consistent.
Because the higher criticism, I guess, has a broad cultural impact of making people accept something like Darwinism,
absolutely,
dialectical materialism, denying the universe of a teleocratic meaning, and that, of course, that would be the type of worldview that the men who run the British Empire would want to promote, because that's the Newtonian world, and these things. Yeah.
Right.
Is there any? You mentioned this. It's funny that was it the Process Church, the Final Judgment.
Good point.
Very similar to this. I'm looking at this. The good, evil. Even you had the passing of Charles Manson, who said, "I'm the devil, I'm God." Right.
Exactly.
So he was whatever you can make sense, whatever sense you can make out of his rantings. You saw that in that type of idea that good and evil have to exist. Therefore, evil is God's will too, right? Because it's part of this process. Mm-hmm. If I have that doctrine of theology, if you want to call it that, correct?
Yeah, interesting. I was reading kind of a modern academic approach to ancient Vedic texts recently, and in the ancient Vedic texts, there were a lot of similar philosophical debates going on thousands of years ago, and the essence of those debates was over monism and dualism. And what you'll see in the history of philosophy, not just in ancient Eastern, but in the history of Western philosophy up into the Greeks and so forth, especially with the Egyptians too, the Hermetica, is the same kind of debate into Plato, into Aristotle, up into the medieval guys, and then into especially somebody like Hegel or Whitehead, whose whole philosophy is basically process philosophy. And then Darwin too, or Marx, is this dialectic of the one and the many. And the idea here is basically, is reality at its fundamental base one thing, or two things, or more? Is it one thing or many things? And so what you get is a tension. There's an assumption that there's a tension between monism, which is the idea that all reality is one thing, or a dualism, that all reality is a fundamental positive, negative, day, night, black, white, right? And this is characteristic, of course, of like many ancient Far Eastern, or like Chinese, Shinto, Taoist type views. So the reason this is relevant is that most world religions will actually fall into one of those two categories. And even, I'm not obviously a fan of ancient Hinduism, but I'm saying that they kind of noticed this, interestingly, that they were all debating, hey man, everything's either one thing or a bunch of things. What you're getting at with the examples of the modern cults are really just manifestations of that same problem, where fundamental reality is conceived of as, if you conceive of it as one thing, then everything that manifests is essentially an illusion, because anything that's distinct is illusory. This is why they have that the doctrine of Maya in ancient Hindu philosophy. It's just an illusion, because everything's just one thing, right? And atomism is in a way a kind of version of this, because they're saying, oh yeah, it looks like there's a table and there's a chair and there's me and there's you, but really at base we're just atoms. So the distinctions, they're all meaningless, because we all just return to being meaningless bouncing atoms, and then we come back in some new form, perhaps, right? And then you have, well, maybe it's dualism. Maybe everything is a fundamental positive, negative charge, or day and night, black and white. But there's not really any clear way to distinguish at times which is which. And so, ironically, a lot of times dualism will often collapse into monism or solipsism. A great example of this would be Descartes. Descartes' philosophy, for example, posits a strong dialectical tension or contrast between the body and the soul. So one might think that Descartes' view is very dualistic, or this is Cartesian dualism, as it's often called. However, the more that you delve into Descartes, the more difficult it became for Descartes to figure out whether there was an external world of body at all. In other words, isn't it all just in his mind?
Yeah.
So in other words, Descartes' philosophy of dualism very easily slipped into solipsism. And solipsism is just another version of monism, because it says that all that exists is mind. Everything's just a manifestation of my mind. So we're back at Maya now. We're back at illusion, dream philosophy. We're in the Matrix, man. So how do we ever get out of the Matrix? Well, that's the trick. You don't. You never know when you're out. So what I'm getting at is all the world philosophies, basically, world religions, they all, almost always, devolve into and fall into this basic trap and problem. Now, the one that I believe is why I believe it is partly because I don't believe it falls into this trap, but that's a different topic. But what I'm getting at is that process church is a very clear example of another one of these manifestations of, let's just take one of the ancient debates of ancient religion and philosophy, dualism, monism, and let's prepackage it into a new kind of cult. And if you consider, for example, Masonry, as many Masons do, just a symbolic interpretation of forces and principles of nature, then you will see again how this very easily bridges to Salk and Koestler, because what do you see in nature? Well, you see a generative principle. So there's your obelisks. You see the vaginal principle. So there's your, Vesica Pisces or something like that. You see day and night, black and white, male, female. So there's your dualism. There's your Jake and Boaz. You see all of this in nature. And so since nature exemplifies all of these things, is there really any one that's preeminent over the other one? Not really. I mean, positive and negative numbers, right? So everything becomes kind of encapsulated under this Masonic reading of nature. And so therefore what I'm getting at is just that distinctions are again eliminated in that way. Jesus is just as much Satan as Jesus, which is blasphemous. But what I'm saying is that they are saying that it's just a manifestation of principles in nature. And what do you see in nature? Well, you're born, but you also die. Yeah. Birth, death, life, death. So it's all the same.
And I guess one could rationalize very easily just being a deviant or degenerate with that type of worldview.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Crowley said that the essence of Crowleyism, I don't remember where, but there's some quote where he says that the essence of Crowleyism is that no act is any greater or lesser than any other act.
Yeah, and which is why this whole thing on inversion and transvaluation and thing is very prominent. Yeah.
And that's how you will. Everything balances out.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, that's why you have the black mass, and something like sodomy is so prevalent in Crowleyan something, because it's what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, a person of that view might say, you come presenting pro-life. Well, I believe in nature, and nature has just as much of a principle of death as it does pro-life.
Yeah, which goes back to that.
What do you see? What do you see in nature? You see predator and prey. You see disease.
Which goes back to what you're talking about, the idea of the fall, and the notion of Genesis, the importance of accepting that story. Because
this is exactly what Father Seraphim Rose argues in his gigantic Genesis book. Is that early on in the book he says, look, this is why Genesis is so important. It's just as important as the Gospels, because you really can't understand the purpose of Christ coming without a historic fall. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to believe Ken Ham and every evangelical. They're not properly interpreting the text. We look to the church fathers and the councils and so forth, the tradition of the church. But But yes, you have to understand that. And another interesting point that he makes too is that in those early, we don't actually understand what it was like in Eden. So we, as Orthodox, we would say that there's a very disruptive state, or a very disruptive change occurred from the way that life was lived in Eden as to the way life is lived now. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we would not say that even death in the animal kingdom, right, mosquitoes or whatever, that would not be the normal mode of operation in the Edenic state. And this is why, for example, a lot of people don't know this, but this is why, for example, you don't have the mentioning of eating meat until Noah. A lot of people think that meat eating was going on, but actually it wasn't. It's not until Noah that you actually have the allowance of eating meat. So that's because the things were still very close to the Edenic period. But I'm just trying to stress that we don't believe that Eden was. It's not like, some place over in Egypt somewhere or on a mountain somewhere. That it was actually a completely different metaphysical state of being where matter and spirit were not kind of divided as they are in a post-fall state. And this is the way Paul speaks of it in Romans 8.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You recently had a very interesting video, Cults, Hollywood Espionage, and Large-Scale Social Engineering. And in that talk, you kind of covered, what's going on in Hollywood now, and kind of explaining it, giving your own interpretation, what's really going on there. Do you want to quickly get into that, or do you have time? Or okay, we're back. So, Cults, Hollywood Espionage, and Large-Scale Social Engineering. Great piece, and you include that Randy Quaid thing. Which, well, anyway, I'll let you talk about it.
Well, I was trying to remember what all I said in that talk. I was I was exhausted. I spent like the whole day on that one. I think I was talking about. I think I started with the Dutroux affair.
Yeah.
And, I found some documentary stuff on that was neat, where people who were directly involved in investigating it and whatnot said that, hey, it looks like he was getting some help from high up.
Yeah.
Which kind of confirms the so-called conspiracy theory. And that was because it involved, high up people in government and so forth in Belgium. And that what I was just saying is that we see these patterns with, networks that traffic people and so forth, and then how the similar patterns emerge in the scandals of Hollywood people. And we were talking about, I was talking about the Harvey Weinstein case, and that it actually came out in multiple mainstream news sources, not just the New York Daily News and that lengthy piece, but then it came out in, I think, Washington Post and New York Times too, that he'd been using a black cube. Mm-hmm. It was a so-called former Mossad, quote unquote, Mossad agency to track people who might tattletale on Harvey Weinstein.
Mm-hmm. Didn't they pose as activists and things like that?
And they did all kinds of things like posing as feminists and, messaging, getting hold of, I guess, Rose McGowan and other people too. But, what else did I talk about? I'm going blank.
Well, you were talking. Well, one thing is you cite the Dutroux affair, and of course, and if people looking to that, read Dave McGowan's book, and right. I think a good 30% of the book is on the Dutroux affair, if I recall reading it. There's a huge portion of it, and it just shows you sort of the high level. You mentioned the human trafficking, kidnapping, mm-hmm. Sort of the sex trafficking, serial killing, leading into this whole types of these predators are agents for very wealthy, powerful people. They
seem to get away with this for a very long time, and and be very well connected, right?
But with the Hollywood, the Weinstein thing is, of course, the idea of the star was it Randy Quaid, who claimed he was being harassed and targeted, and everyone thought he was nuts. Right. But this would seem to lend some credence to what he was saying back then, and how he can be targeted by agents and lawyers and corporations to be, I guess, become a targeted individual. I guess, to be harassed and then ruined and have his money stolen from him.
Yeah, a lot of people made fun of the Star Whackers claim for a long time because they said, "Oh, Randy Quaid is just, he's on drugs and he's crazy." And I don't really know that much about Randy Quaid other than various movies he's been in, so I have no idea what his personal life is like. So I'm not saying pro or con, but I'm saying that isn't it interesting that he said this stuff several years ago, and it was kind of a viral conspiracy video at one point. And then here we have mainstream news now coming out with a story that, actually there are kind of Star Whackers in a way.
And he said this: sometimes the studio comes to the conclusion that a star is easier dead than alive.
Well, think of Brittany Murphy.
Yes. In the case of Brittany Murphy, where both her husband and her were poisoned, it turns out. Yeah, poisoned. They both got sick, but there was some sort of heavy metal poisoning or something. It was weird. And, of course, that factors into that case with that border guard, Davis. She was a witness in a very odd case, strange case.
It was very bizarre, right?
Yeah, if you get into that case, Judy, I think her name was Judy Davis or something, and her father was they raided her house, and her husband was involved in movie production, and that somehow entangled Brittany Murphy, and that ultimately led to her demise and perhaps her husband's demise. But in the video, you're going about Hollywood, and of course the role Hollywood has played is in large-scale social engineering, and the whole idea of something like the Weinstein scandal, I think, is itself, I think, a form of social engineering or social alchemy or something.
Yes, and I think that you were talking to Chris most recently. I heard that interview, and that came up, and I think you mentioned Wag the Dog a couple times in recent interviews, and the Lewinsky scandal, and how that kind of got everybody talking about something very degenerate. And I think that that's true. And you can't find, or I found a great example of that in the Heidi Fleiss case.
Yeah.
Heidi Fleiss is basically saying that even she recognized that she was a cultural change agent. I don't know how cognizant of that she was in the 90s, but a more recent reflection that she had in that interview, she was saying, there's a direct connect from what was going on at that time in pop culture with Pretty Woman was out, which kind of had this glorification of prostitution, and Richard Gere and Julia Roberts, and Madonna was very popular at that time with all of her gross videos and whatnot. And then she said, then I was on the scene, and she said, I kind of invented the it girl, and it went from me to Paris Hilton to Kim Kardashian. And she said that I kind of prepared the way for reality TV. And she said, if you remember at that time, there was hard copy and Inside Edition. And she said that these shows were, and she actually used some kind of phrase we would use, like, like a global cultural change agent or some weird phrase she even used. So she seemed to be, pretty cognizant of what was going on, at least nowadays.
Well, I mean, the whole thing of the creation of the cult of celebrity, I think, is there to some form of an agent for social alchemy. I think Bernays started the concept of the star with Enrico Caruso, the rock idol, or the celebrity culture. How this started with the cinema, of course, and the successful construction of a movie theater in every town in America, and what that would have, the effect it would have on culture. Obviously, the whole idea of what a movie star looks like, with the whole notions of beauty and expectation in life, and this coupled with increasing mobility, this would have a profound effect on American society. Once again, a sort of a destruction of local tradition and these things. But the scandal... Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
This whole idea of celebrity scandal, right? Divorce, and the fact that people are obsessed with private celebrity lives, and of course Heidi Fleiss, we have the whole thing with this sordid sex life, and it begs the question: why is this even news? Right?
Oh, she says I normalized cheating.
Yeah.
And so from the normalization of cheating, it just goes downhill even worse from there.
Yeah. And so now we have all this talk. I mean, we're getting into the sort of details of what Louis C.K. proposed to do in front of women in a hotel room. Now, why is this? I mean, from what I understand, there's no laws that are being violated here. It's just a, rather strange proposal from a degenerate celebrity. And even John Adams talks about this. He says how a lot of these cases are he said, she said, and men are just owning up to it. Yeah, I did it. I'm sorry. Blah blah blah.
Right.
I'm going to go get counseling now. When they could just say it's none of your business what happened between. Really, you have right to say that. She may make that claim, but it really is none of your business. And then no one says that. When what's interesting enough, you mentioned, of course, the Pretty Woman, and I heard this on Ed Opperman. That the apartment in that movie was Elizabeth Short's apartment.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, when she comes down, I think the end, I don't know if you saw Pretty Woman. Did you ever see Pretty Woman?
A long time ago, but I don't remember it. I think I was with a girlfriend or something who wanted to watch it.
And the end where Richard Gere comes and gets her apartment, and she comes down the fire escape, if I recall. I'm trying to remember myself. I think it's late 80s. Early 90s, maybe 1990. But yeah, that was Elizabeth Short's apartment, from what I understand. So
that's bizarre.
Yeah. The Black Dahlia, as they say.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, all this obsessed on Hollywood, and why, like I said, at any moment in history of Hollywood, you could focus on the casting couch, and Kenneth Anger wrote about this stuff in Hollywood Babylon.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And another point too is that I just went blank. I had a point.
Well, I mean, a lot of the stuff is the blackmail, of course, the function that it serves. You mentioned also the the DC Madam. And
I read a long thing about Deborah Jean Palfrey and her whole story. And what was interesting was that there were 80 something escort services in DC at that time. And she actually asked a good question. She said, "Why am I the focus of a giant investigation and news story?" Now, I'm sure it had to do with, she had high-profile people, just like Heidi Fleiss did in her books or whatever. But that's probably just one level of it, because it's similar to the Fleiss story, because Heidi Fleiss's clients, if I recall, were mainly Hollywood people. The DC Madam's clients are mainly government corporate people.
Yeah.
In other words, you have the erosion and the what's the word I'm looking for? The attempt to portray all aspects of society as
degenerate. Corrupt.
Degenerate, exactly. Yeah. And what that does is, in a way, it kind of fits into what H.G. Wells talked about, that the way to, we're not going to completely tear down every existing institution. He says that's the naive Marxist view. He says what we need to do is infiltrate, subvert, and basically turn the institutions inside out from within. So what you're doing here is you're seeing the kind of not that American politicians were ever noble or great, but I think what we're seeing is that in each area of life, you kind of have a destruction of the institution to turn it inside out into a force for a coming technocracy that's even more powerful.
Yeah.
So like you were saying earlier, it's not going to be all these different studios. You're going to have, a few select mega corporate interests that will control entertainment. You'll have Disney and Netflix basically deciding entertainment.
And making sure that people want to be constantly entertained, or you're not entertained. And that's how you get the cultural change. Because if first you need everyone to be obsessed with Hollywood to have the effect of a Hollywood scandal, right? I mean, everyone has
That's a good point. Yeah.
Same thing with politics too. Sort of the mix and the merging of Hollywood and politics. The whole Kevin Spacey thing, right? I mean, think about that.
House of Cards, right? Good point.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and if you're watching movies now, they bring in real news people to do. I mean,
oh yeah, you'll see Wolf Blitzer on James Bond, right?
Yeah, I'm not kidding you. Sharknado 4 had Matt Lauer.
Wow.
So, Sharknado 4. So that not an A-list movie by any stretch of the imagination. Not a B movie. So I remember I saw this this is like in the 90s. There's that movie with Robert Klein about the sort of like a play on the Prince and the Pauper, where he becomes president because he looks just like the president. And they started using real news people.
You mentioned Dave.
Dave, yeah, Dave. So that was when I first started noticing.
Interesting.
In movies, started the blurring
of
of reality.
But I've forgotten that.
Yeah. The real news figures and all. I mean, real media figures would be debating these things, and that's how the blending of reality and fiction. And of course, so much of politics, so much of news is indeed fiction. So, I think it's good that we ended the interview talking about Hollywood, because that's H.G. Wells would have considered entertainment. Obviously he wrote science fiction, right?
This is another point I want to make.
Yeah,
this is another point I want to make that is in my book too. Is a lot of people overlook the fact that we think of Hollywood as inculcating degeneracy and promoting sexual aberration and whatnot, which is all true, but we overlook the fact that all of these chapels in all the cities that you're talking about, called movie theaters, have also taught everyone for many, many, many decades Darwinism and scientism.
Yes.
Through H.G. Wells stories, through Star Trek, Star Wars, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. And they've done it through entertainment. And that's where you get everyone's rapt attention, is through entertainment. And that's everyone. That's how most people see politics and history and understand the world is through the silver screen, and that's
Well, that's definitely one way to explain the success of Donald Trump is you have an entertainer who understands business, entertainment, and now I suppose politics.
Yeah,
because they're not really different worlds, are they?
No, they're not.
I guess Nancy and Ron figured that out a long time ago after playing with that monkey in the Bedtime for Bonzo movie.
Yep, Bedtime for Bonzo. Ronald Reagan, the actor, became the politician and governor, then president, and it is the same thing, So anything else, Jay? I know you're kind of under the weather. I mean, do you have any other points?
No, I think that's all I've got tonight.
Okay, listen, I want to thank you for being a trooper. I know you're not feeling well and coming back on. That's great.
No problem.
Jay Dyer, Jay's Analysis, author of Esoteric Hollywood. You can subscribe to his website. It's $4.95 a month, $60 a year, and you get all his media and his analysis and these things. Also, Hollywood Decoded on the Guide Network.
Correct. Yeah. And if you want to see a season 2 of that, go ahead and subscribe and share that with your friends, because that will determine whether there'll be a season 2. Hoping there will be. We still don't know yet. Also, I remember what I was going to tell you at the beginning of the talk. I'm getting together the sequel to Esoteric Hollywood, which will be called Esoteric Hollywood: The Sequel. Okay.
So just when you thought it was safe to open a book, right?
Yeah, right.
The sequel.
So hopefully next year the sequel to Esoteric Hollywood will be out, and it'll be largely a lot of new material.